And turning to news about the Middle East now, the UN Human Rights Council voted on Friday to send a team of international war crimes investigators to probe the deadly shootings of Gaza protesters by Israeli forces. With 29 votes in favor, 2 opposed and 14 abstentions, the UN's top human rights body voted through a resolution calling on the Council to urgently dispatch an independent international commission of inquiry. The United Nations had sharply criticized Israel for its actions against protesters in Gaza on Monday that led to the deaths of 60 Palestinians. UN Human Rights Chief Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein accused Israel of systematically depriving Palestinians of their human rights. Susan Mwongeli reports.
Israel, as an occupying power under international law, is obligated to protect the population of Gaza and ensure their welfare. But they are, in essence, caged in a toxic slum from birth to death.
The United Nations rights chief was very direct in his criticism of Israel's actions against Palestinians.
Deprived of dignity, dehumanized by the Israeli authorities to such a point, it appears officials do not even consider that these men and women have a right, as well as every reason, to protest.
Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein said Israel used quote-unquote wholly disproportionate force against Palestinian border protesters and said Gaza's occupation by Israel had to end. He was speaking at a special session of the UN Human Rights Council. The meeting is considering calling for an independent investigation.
I therefore endorse calls made by many states and observers for an investigation that is international, independent and impartial, in the hope the truth regarding these matters will lead to justice.
Responding to criticism from the UN Human Rights Chief, Israel ambassador accused Gaza's militant Islamist rulers of deliberately putting civilians in harm's way.
It is Israel, certainly not Hamas, which makes a real effort to minimize casualties among Palestinian civilians. Israeli commanders and soldiers are guided by international law in their actions. The IDF took all available precautionary measures and has warned residents of the danger they would face should they engage in violent riots. But Hamas urged them to be on the front lines as human shields, hiding terrorists and endangering their lives.
Some 60 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces on Monday in the 7th consecutive week of border protests. It was the deadliest day in Gaza since a 2014 war between Israel and militants there. Susan Mwongeli, CGTN.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined by CGTN's Nick Harper in New York and Stephanie Fried in Tel Aviv. Nick, let's start with you in New York. Just tell us more about the meeting from by the Human Rights Council and what more the leaders said at this session.
Well, Lindy, as we heard in that report there, some very direct statements coming out of that council meeting, some angry words and sentiments expressed. Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the UN Human Rights Chief, was very direct in his criticism of Israel and the type of force that they had used. As we heard, he said that it was wholly disproportionate, and he pointed to the fact that there was one Israeli soldier injured slightly by a stone, whereas there was 43 Palestinians killed at the border on Monday and another 17 Palestinians killed away from that area. He said that there was a real disconnect between those two levels, the two sides, in terms of the levels of violence that they both saw. He also said that in terms of the Israeli soldiers, there had been little evidence of any attempt to minimize casualties, and he said that therefore suggested that they were willfully killing Palestinians, which in itself went very much against the Geneva Convention. He called for the occupation of Gaza to be ended by Israel. But then on the other side, we heard from Israel and from the United States really attacking the council itself. Israel's representative saying that this was the worst form of anti-Israel obsession and that the council was spreading lies against Israel. Israel. Instead, Israel blamed Hamas for getting many of the civilians in the front lines of those protests, so they were in the line of fire. The US charge d'affaires also at that meeting said that this was very much a one-sided council, the Human Rights Council itself being a broken body, as it was described by the United States.
Well, indeed, very strong and somewhat divided opinions being expressed there. Stephanie, as we heard, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, of course, defending his country's response. But has there been any reaction from Israel on this criticism that's coming from the UN?
Oh, absolutely. And there's been a reaction from the very top, which is Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Within the past hour, he has given his statement, his response. And I'll just read a little bit to you of what he had to say. Equally strong words, as we heard Nick recounting what happened during today's session. Mr. Netanyahu also did not mix words. Here are some of the things that he said. This decision by the UN is nothing new under the sun. It's hypocritical, it's anti-Israel, and it shows the body's backing of terror in general. He said that Israel vehemently rejects the claims, and the majority was arrived at by an anti-Israel body. Results would have been clear ahead of time into any investigation, says Mr. Netanyahu, and that Israel's policy will continue to be, to defend its citizens, defend its soldiers, and carry on in the name of self-defense. So very, very strong rejection of that vote on the part of Israel's prime minister, which really is the top, and that's the final sort of word in here from this end.
Indeed, that response, really no big surprises there. But Nick, coming back to you, we've seen Palestinian representatives as you mentioned, they've been very vocal. They've also received a great deal of support from other member countries. But essentially, what do Palestinian representatives want addressed at the level of the UN Security Council?
Well, in many ways, they're looking for this two-pronged approach. So we've had this investigation being approved by the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Here in New York, the Security Council level, they want the Council to be able to uphold the resolutions that we've had in the past. We heard from the Palestinian ambassador earlier this week, Riyad Mansour, talking about the fact that there was this need to uphold resolutions that have been voted on by the Security Council in the past, but are quite simply being disregarded by Israel now and by the United States as their ally. And he pointed to ones in particular that called for the protection of civilians, of journalists and humanitarian workers as well. And he's also looking for some sort of united response in the Security Council, which will, of course, be very, very difficult. The US is one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. We already know that earlier this week they rejected a unified statement that the Security Council was trying to agree on. It wouldn't have been legally binding, but it would have at least shown a united front. And I think that's one of the big problems. Despite the calls from the Palestinians to have some sort of consensus at the Security Council to find a plan to move forward, they are still very, very divided. And the US and its response will keep it divided because of its strong alliance to Israel.
And Stephanie, of course, Friday marked the start of the holy month of Ramadan, and with it came calls for Gazans to continue protesting at the Gaza border. What's likely going to be the response from Israel? Are we going to see soldiers maintain that position on the border in anticipation of more violence in the coming days?
Well, it's really going to depend on both sides. Israel's going to keep an eye on it, obviously, and continue to show up there at that dividing fence if there are threats of breaching the fence. They'll be watching social media to see what sort of calls to come and protest and what the tone is, and they'll continue being there. On the flip side, inside of Gaza, from Ismail Haniyeh, he's one of the Hamas leaders in Gaza, he has said that this will not stop. Protesting will not stop until the siege is lifted. He's referring to Israel's land and sea blockade of Gaza and control of what goes in and out of Gaza. At the same time, though, there are very strong rumors that Ismail Haniyeh, he recently was in Cairo in the past week, that he struck some sort of deal with Egypt and an agreement to tone down these protests, tone down the calls for people to show up at that dividing fence between the two sides. He denies that. However, now, as of Ramadan, which just began within the past day, the border opening between Egypt and Gaza, it will be open. It was announced for the entire month of Ramadan. One can't help but wonder if that may have been part of a deal.
Indeed. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to Stephanie Fried, live for us there in Tel Aviv, and of course Nick Harper in New York.